Working as a behavioral therapist, I'd met people facing all kinds of challenges. After 5 years, it felt like there was little that could surprise me anymore. That was until I met Ethan. He was a 15-year-old with big, hollow eyes that rarely looked up, and his father, Sam, brought him in for an evaluation, insisting his son might be on the autism spectrum. Sam had noted Ethan's difficulties with social interactions, his lack of friends, and his tendency to withdraw into himself. Our sessions were quiet at first. Ethan rarely spoke, answering my questions with barely a nod or a whisper. I'd encourage him to talk about his interests or daily life, but it felt like I was pulling his words out thread by thread. The few times Sam stepped out of the room, Ethan would open up a bit more, though there was always a nervous glance toward the door, as if he feared his father might burst back in at any moment. Over time, Ethan started sharing little things, like the fact that his parents argued every night, the way the walls seemed to close in on him, and how small his world felt. His parents, he mentioned quietly, couldn't stand to be in the same room together. He was an only child, isolated with no close family nearby. Yet, his eyes lit up when I mentioned fall. I told him I loved the season too. The crisp air, the colors of the leaves, and, in particular, anything with pumpkin. We laughed a little over our mutual obsession with pumpkin-flavored treats. That simple conversation made him smile. And I felt for a moment that we'd reached a breakthrough. But what started as a harmless bonding moment quickly took a strange turn. That night, I heard a knock at my door long after dark. My heart raced a little as I tiptoed to the window, peeking through the blinds. No one was there. But when I opened the door, I found a small pumpkin in a pumpkin-flavored coffee creamer, sitting alone on the doorstep. At first, I laughed, thinking maybe it was a thoughtful gift from a neighbor. But something in the back of my mind kept tugging at me, a whisper of a feeling that something was wrong. I stood in my doorway, staring at the little pumpkin and creamer on my doorstep, my pulse racing. It felt too specific, too precise to be a random gesture. Only hours ago, I'd shared my love of pumpkin with Ethan, and now here they were, just outside my home. Feeling unsettled, I texted Sam, suggesting that Ethan may have crossed a line by showing up at my house. Sam's reply was immediate and defensive, almost offended by the mere suggestion. He insisted his son would never do something like that Ethan was far too shy to attempt such a bold gesture. A knot of unease grew in my stomach, but I brushed it off, convincing myself that maybe it was all just some strange coincidence. Still, I wrestled with whether I should keep seeing Ethan. I decided to give it one more session, if only to assess how he acted in person. When Sam and Ethan walked into my office the following week, everything seemed normal. Ethan was his usual quiet self, and Sam stood by the door with his arms crossed, watching us like a hawk. Trying to keep things light, I brought up the gift at my door with a smile, hinting at how odd it was for something so specific to show up that same evening. Ethan looked genuinely surprised, shaking his head with wide eyes while Sam's face tightened. I tried to read his reaction, but something about his tense expression and the way he glared at me made my skin crawl. I couldn't quite place it, but the air in the room felt thick, uncomfortable, and I was certain I'd end our sessions if anything like that happened again. 2 nights later, just as I started to feel at ease again, another knock sounded at my door. This time, the sound felt different, sharp and insistent. My stomach churned as I walked to the door, dread filling me because I knew exactly what I'd find. Opening it slowly, I saw an assortment of pumpkin-flavored items scattered across the doorstep, a whole pumpkin pie, a box of pumpkin Cheerios, and a package of pumpkin Oreos. The sight felt almost obscene, like some dark mockery of my previous conversation with Ethan. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture, planning to confront Sam and Ethan the next day and demand answers. But as I typed out a message, my thumb hovered over the send button. I heard the soft, distinct chime of a phone notification coming from the bushes just a few feet away. My body froze, and a chill ran through me. In the dim porch light, I could make out a faint rustle from the bushes. A dark figure crouched low, trying to stay hidden. I felt my breath catch as I whispered, "Ethan." But as I took a hesitant step forward, a familiar face emerged from the shadows. It was Sam, crouched in the bushes, his phone screen glowing eerily in the dark. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and almost wild, and smiled, whispering, "Hi, Claire. You look beautiful tonight." As I watched Sam's car disappear into the night, a cold realization washed over me, making my skin crawl. He hadn't brought Ethan in just for therapy. He'd used his son to get close to me, lurking around my life, planning these disturbing gifts to test how I'd react. The sessions, Ethan's reluctance to speak, Sam's constant presence in the room, it all fell into place like pieces of a twisted puzzle. He wasn't just a worried father. He was watching, waiting. The next morning, I went to the police. They took my statement, but without any physical evidence or outright threats, there wasn't much they could do. Still, I made sure they had Sam's information and raised concerns for Ethan's safety, wondering how much of this poor boy's anxiety was rooted in his father's obsessive behavior. As I left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd only scratched the surface of something far darker. For a few days, I tried to return to normal, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Every creak of my house settling made me jump. Every car slowing down near my street sent my heart racing. I knew I'd see Sam again. I could feel it as surely as I could feel his gaze on me, even when I was alone. Then, one night, I noticed something. A small smear of dirt on the floor just inside my back door. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. My stomach twisted as I checked my locks yet again. Everyone was secure, but the feeling of his presence was as tangible as if he were standing right there. The pumpkin gifts stopped after that, but my life felt shattered, split between the me who could sleep soundly and the me who double-checked every lock, every night. I knew he'd be back. People like Sam didn't just stop. And every time I thought of Ethan, of the look in his eyes when he glanced nervously toward the door, I felt a pang of helplessness. How many times had Ethan looked out into the night and felt his father's shadow, just as I did now? For Ethan's sake, I can only hope that he finds a way out of his father's twisted grip, even as I wonder if I'll ever feel safe again. It was a Friday night in early October, years ago. The air was crisp, a chilly 60 degrees with a light breeze that made the leaves on the trees rustle just enough to sound like whispers. I was out with my three best friends, Leo, Max, and Sophie. We were bored teenagers in a town that didn't offer much more than cornfields and the occasional haunted hayride. Too young for bars, too restless for just hanging out at home, we were looking for something to make the night memorable. And when Max suggested exploring the old pumpkin farm up on Carter's Road, we jumped at the chance. Farmer Joe's pumpkin patch, they called it, though no one really knew if that was even the old owner's name. For as long as I could remember, the place had been abandoned, left to decay at the edge of town. Rumors drifted around about why the place shut down. A bad harvest, an accident, even some whispered tragedies. But no one had ever confirmed anything. It was just left to rot, an eerie skeleton of a once thriving place, so we set out, biking up the quiet road, feeling the weight of the night settle in. The road was deserted, just endless cornfields stretching into darkness, the occasional old farmhouse popping up like lonely shadows in the distance. When we finally saw the outline of the pumpkin farm, we slowed down. There it was, tucked between the last of the cornfields in a thick, wild forest, the moon casting a dim glow over the sagging farmhouse and overgrown fields. We ditched our bikes by the broken-down porch and grabbed our flashlights, trying to act braver than we felt. "All right, let's see what's left of this place," Leo said, his voice a little too loud in the night air. Flashlights cutting through the darkness, we started wandering around, making out the faint remains of a pumpkin patch, tangled in weeds. Farther back was an old wooden fence around what must have been A petting zoo, the splintered wood half buried in the wild grass. We were laughing, nudging each other, making stupid ghost noises, trying to outspook each other. We felt like explorers, even if it was just an old, forgotten farm. Then we spotted the farmhouse. It looked a lot worse up close. The paint was peeling, windows broken, the door hanging off one hinge. We dared each other to go in, of course. I think we all felt that rush, the kind of thrill you get right before you're about to do something you know you probably shouldn't but we were teenagers, and we wanted a story to tell. As we stepped onto the creaky porch, I took one last look at the field behind us, the rows of shriveled vines and empty stalls swallowed by the night. We pushed open the door and stepped inside, the smell of rot and dust thick in the air. And just like that, the laughter stopped. The scream that filled the room was raw, jagged, and inhuman, as if it came from somewhere deep and unnatural within him. Leo and I stood frozen, the sound pounding through our ears, turning our blood to ice. It was loud and drawn out, echoing through the empty, decaying house. Our flashlights shook in our hands as we stared at the figure, this man, or thing, that had been slamming its head against the wall just seconds before. And then, without warning, it stopped screaming. A silence as thick as the dust in the air settled over us. We were barely breathing, afraid to make a sound, afraid that anything we did would bring that figure toward us. It was only when I noticed my flashlight trembling in my grip that I realized how tight I'd been clenching it. My heart was racing, a thundering pulse that I could feel in my chest, my head, everywhere. Slowly, I reached out and grabbed Leo's arm, giving it a slight tug as a signal that we needed to leave. Now. The figure didn't move, but we weren't about to wait around and see if it would. Leo and I took careful steps backward, our flashlights still trained on that man in the corner. But then, as soon as our feet hit the hallway, the silence broke again. Heavy, stomping footsteps echoed from the room, but this time they weren't coming from us. They were coming from him. The man's shadowed figure lurched forward, his steps frantic, uneven, as he started coming toward the doorway, toward us. I didn't stop to think. I just grabbed Leo and ran. Our footsteps slamming down the hallway as fast as we could manage, our flashlights bouncing wildly, sending shards of light onto the peeling walls around us. "Sophie, Max," I shouted, practically flying down the stairs. They'd already heard the commotion and were standing at the bottom, wide-eyed and terrified, flashlights raised. "Run, just go," I yelled, not even stopping as we hit the ground floor. Sophie let out a gasp, her face pale, and Max grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. As we stumbled over the threshold and into the yard, I could hear the footsteps growing louder behind us. The figure was following us, and there was no way we were going to stop and look back. The farmhouse seemed to groan in protest, as if the walls themselves were trying to keep us in, like they didn't want to let us go. I felt something brush past me, something cold, as if the air itself was pushing us out. The moment we reached the yard, the scream tore through the night again, wilder, more furious, like it knew we were getting away. It seemed to follow us as we sprinted to our bikes, each one of us scrambling to grab the handlebars, not caring about anything but getting the hell away from that place. The last thing I heard before we took off was the slam of the farmhouse door and another blood-chilling thud from somewhere inside, as if he'd gone back to slamming his head against the wall. We didn't stop pedaling until we were halfway down Carter's Road, the farmhouse shrinking into the distance behind us. Even though the screaming had faded, we were still gripped by this gnawing terror that clung to us like the autumn chill. No one spoke, and all I could hear was the sound of our frantic breathing, our wheels slicing through the night, and the pounding of my own heart. When we finally got to my house, we all jumped off our bikes, collapsing onto the grass in silence, gasping for air. It took a few minutes before any of us even looked at each other. Sophie sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her face pale in the glow of the porch light. Leo was silent, just staring down the road as if he could still see the outline of the farmhouse looming there in the dark. Max shook his head, muttering, "What the hell was that?" But no one had an answer. We sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. We didn't say the words, but it was clear we all felt it. there was something wrong with that place, something that hadn't wanted us there, something that maybe hadn't been alive in the way we understood. I remember thinking of all the rumors, the stories of people going missing, of bad harvests and strange deaths that had drifted through town over the years, and I wondered if maybe they weren't just stories. We never spoke about it again after that night, not really. Once, a couple of months later, I tried to bring it up with Leo. He looked at me with this haunted expression, shook his head and said, "Let's just leave it." Okay. And that was that. But every October, when the nights get colder and the wind picks up just like it did back then, I remember that scream. I hear it in my mind as clear as the night we were there. A tortured, agonizing howl that doesn't sound human. I don't know what we encountered in that abandoned farmhouse. Whether it was a ghost, a spirit, or something even darker. Maybe it was just a tragic remnant of a life gone wrong. Something that refused to be forgotten. Whatever it was. I haven't been back up Carter's Road since. I don't think I ever will. Some things are better left alone, lost to time, fading with the season. But as Halloween approaches every year, I'm always reminded of that night, of that scream, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the shadows of that old, forgotten place, it's still waiting. When I was 6, my family took me to this mountaintop resort, a place that felt like it was plucked from a storybook. We'd been there once before, and I remembered the cozy log cabins, the winding forest paths, and the smell of wood smoke that seemed to linger in the air. My mom loved going in the fall when the trees transformed into a patchwork of red, orange, and yellow. She'd say the leaves looked like they were on fire, making everything feel warm and magical. The resort was lively that second time we went, even more than the first. There were hayrides, bonfires, s'mores, and even a little fireworks show. It felt like everyone there was wrapped in the same excitement and warmth, and I could hardly wait to do all the activities. Mike, my older brother, was 10 and tasked with keeping an eye on me, though he often got distracted. My parents had their hands full with my little brother, who was only 4, and needed constant attention. That night, we gathered around the bonfire after a hayride at sunset, the flames casting shadows that flickered across everyone's faces. Mike had already drifted off to find some new friends. That's when I noticed an older man sitting nearby. He seemed friendly enough, dressed in a thick flannel shirt and one of those big puffy vests that looked like they'd keep anyone warm. He glanced over at me and smiled, and in an instant, I felt important, like I'd caught his special attention. He leaned over, asked if I was having fun, and said he was one of the resort's owners. My face lit up at that. Meeting someone who owned the place made it feel like I was someone special, someone important. He even handed me a little laser pointer as a gift, telling me it was just for me. I took it, clutching it in my tiny hands. It felt like a piece of the resort, like my own little treasure. A few minutes later, the hayride driver announced he'd be taking one last ride down the big hill in the dark, and Mike called out that we should go. He'd run off again, though, probably finding those friends he made, and before I knew it, the hayride was starting to load. I decided to get on alone, still holding tight to the laser pointer in my hand as I climbed onto the haystacked trailer. I scanned the group for Mike, but he wasn't there. Still, I was excited, sitting on that pile of hay. With the night chill starting to set in, just before we took off, I noticed that same man from the bonfire climb onto the hayride. This time, a woman was with him. They both made their way through the crowded hay bales, and when the man saw me, his eyes lit up. He settled beside me, and when he saw me clutching the laser pointer, he gave me a smile that made me feel like the two of us shared some sort of secret. The woman, who he introduced as his wife, sat beside him, watching me with a smile, just a little too wide. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something about her face that didn't feel right. I remember thinking that it was just, The shadows from the bonfire, or maybe the chill in the air, but as the hayride creaked forward, I felt the kind of unease I hadn't felt before. The hayride rattled along, the cool night air biting into my cheeks as we rolled towards the big hill. I looked around again, hoping to catch sight of Mike. But he was nowhere. The man and woman beside me seemed to notice. They exchanged a glance, and then the man leaned over with a sympathetic smile. "Are you here with your family?" he asked, his voice warm but with a slight edge that made me feel small. I shrugged, mumbling a quiet, "Yeah." But I was too shy to explain they weren't paying attention at that moment. The woman, who he'd introduced as his wife, was watching me. Her smile never reached her eyes, and the way she looked at me felt less like she was being friendly and more like she was sizing me up. As the hayride truck rattled up the last bump before the drop down the hill, I felt a rush of nervousness. The man must have noticed because he reached over, lifting my hands in the air like you would on a roller coaster, grinning as he told me to shout, "No hands." When the truck lurched forward, barreling down the hill, I actually laughed. It was fun, and for a moment I forgot about how strange they felt. They seemed nice again, just friendly adults who wanted to help me have a good time. Once we hit the bottom of the hill, the man leaned in close again, asking, "Did you get a chance to check out the arcade? They've got some really fun games in there." He said he had the key to unlock them all, and when he asked if I wanted it, my eyes lit up. "You have the key?" I gasped, already imagining the arcade machines lighting up just for me. He nodded with a smile, saying he'd just have to get it and that we'd have the whole place to ourselves. As the hayride ended, I clutched my laser pointer and hopped off the trailer, excited about the thought of my very own secret arcade night. The man and his wife got off too, and before I knew it, the woman reached down, wrapping her hand around mine as we walked. "Come on, sweetie," she cooed softly, her tone dripping with sweetness that somehow made me want to pull away. I let her lead me, though, because I didn't want to seem rude. The three of us walked away from the bonfire, stepping further into the shadows of the trail. It was darker on that side of the resort, away from the lights and noise. The path veered away from the main buildings, and with each step I felt a tickle of fear in the back of my mind. But before I could ask anything, I heard a familiar voice. "Hey," Mike called from behind us, his voice breaking through the silence. I turned and saw him by the bonfire, looking confused. I waved and shouted, "We're going to the arcade." He stared back, not saying anything, just watching. For some reason, he didn't follow us. The further we walked from the bonfire, the tighter the woman's grip became. Her hand began to hurt mine, her fingers digging in harder than they should have. When I asked where we were going, the man chuckled and said, "Oh, we're just going to grab the key. It's right this way." But I noticed we weren't walking toward the clubhouse. We were heading closer to the parking lot. I glanced back again, hoping to see Mike, but we were already too far. The further we got from the bonfire, the stranger everything felt. The woman's hand gripped mine tighter, her fingers digging into my skin like claws. I slowed my steps, hesitating as I glanced up at her, noticing how her smile had disappeared, replaced by a stony expression. The man walked just ahead of us, his gaze focused straight ahead as he led us away from the lights of the resort. I tugged my hand, finally working up the nerve to ask, "Isn't the arcade the other way?" My voice came out small and shaky. The man's head turned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he forced a smile. "The key is this way," he replied, his voice flat. The discomfort I'd felt all night erupted into full-blown fear, and I was just about to pull away and run when a voice cut through the darkness. "Let go of him!" My mom's voice tore through the silence, raw with panic and fury. I'd never heard her sound like that. I turned, seeing her running toward us, her face twisted in terror and rage. The woman's hand released mine so fast it was like she'd been burned, and she stumbled back a step, her face going pale. The man raised his hands as my mom stormed toward us, his tone suddenly polite and calm, as if nothing strange had just happened. We were just taking him to the front desk. He looked lost, he explained with a friendly smile that didn't fool anyone. But my mom wasn't buying it. She positioned herself between me and them, screaming for them to stay away from her child. I clung to her, my heart racing as the couple backed away, faces tense but silent. The woman tried to say something, her voice stuttering out a few words, but it was pointless. My mom didn't take her eyes off them as they melted into the shadows, disappearing down the dark trail toward the parking lot. Back at the bonfire, my mom demanded to know if anyone had seen the couple, but nobody recognized them. Even the resort staff seemed stumped. My mom reported what had happened to the staff and the police, but by the time they investigated, the couple was long gone. There was no record of anyone fitting their descriptions as guests, and they had vanished into the night, as if they'd never been there at all. To this day, just the thought of that night sends a shiver through me. The place that once felt so magical now lingers in my mind as something darker, tainted. I sometimes wonder if they're still out there, prowling around places like that resort, looking for another child who wanders too far from their family, eager to trust a friendly stranger with a kind smile.